Okay, so today I want to talk about last week. Last week, I was moving through so many different things, but there was one thing in particular that was predominant for me, and that was the feeling of loneliness. Like, I wasn't anxious, I wasn't dysregulated, I was just fucking lonely. And it was really surprising because the loneliness that I was feeling wasn't coming from like an insecurity. It was coming from embodiment. Now, what the fuck do I mean by that? I remember when I first started healing, there was a moment where, and I think I even did a video about this on TikTok, there was a moment where I said, when you start healing, it starts to feel really lonely. And I've heard lots of other people, say the same thing. And it's because once you really start doing the work to dig into all of your patterns and your trauma and you see how it shows up, you cannot help but see it in everybody else. And it's really alarming. Like, I remember at the time thinking all I see are walking trauma responses everywhere. And at that time, I was still oriented around trying to keep myself safe, right? I was learning about boundaries. I was learning about red flags. I was learning about narcissism and abuse and how to spot all of the signs and all of those things. And so I was still very much in survival, protection energy. And it felt like everyone was a walking red flag. I could see everybody's trauma. I could see everybody's adaptations. It wasn't superiority. It was simply self-protection, right? And it felt really lonely because it was like I could see things that other people couldn't see. And so I naturally created distance. It wasn't like to bypass. It was literally out of protection. Now, the fascinating thing is that I'm not protecting myself anymore. Like, my nervous system is stable. My boundaries are embodied. There is absolutely nothing for me to protect myself from anymore. I don't feel threatened by people's wounds. I can see people for who they are and I can meet them where they are. And so that's why the loneliness felt really odd to me, because it was not about protection. I recognized it was trying to tell me something different. Over the last month, I have made a lot of my own personal changes, right? In the very first episode, I mentioned how the moment that I perceived my authority and my agency. And so once I perceived that, I couldn't unsee it. And then all of a sudden, all of the ways in which I was orienting my energy and showing me where I wasn't embodying that authorship and that agency started to reveal itself. And so I naturally recognized them and needed to start collapsing them. So in the last month, I did a lot of fucking things. The first thing I did was I quit the band that I was playing in. Now, there's a very long story around that, and I won't get into it here because it's interesting but irrelevant to this conversation. But that was the one weekly social engagement that I was in that I decided I needed to temporarily pause. Okay. The next thing I did was I decided to close my membership, because if I was no longer operating from a place of holding people while they heal, then my membership needed to close. And I transformed that into my legacy library. It's an ongoing space where it's a self-led space where you can take all of the tools that I created while I was on my healing journey. It's all there for anybody who wants it, super affordable. Less than a fraction of a therapy session. It's absolutely ridiculous how I'm just essentially trying to give it away. But by closing my membership, I had weekly calls in there. I had clients that were regulars that, I would engage with every week. So there was, a form of contact inside of my membership that now went away. At the same time, I started to recognize that a lot of my relationships existed purely online, whether that's the clients I was working with, whether that's mutuals that I was friends with, whether that was relationships that I have made, like friendships that I have made that I've actually never met these people. We just have ongoing friendships. So I recognized that my entire life was online. Everything that I had been organizing my life around existed online. And that then led me to recognize the very little in-person contact that I actually had. And, I date, but again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning about how when you date, you can see everybody's shadows. Like when you're in this stage of embodiment, you can actually see everything that people have not integrated, and you can see it because you've integrated. So when that loneliness landed for me last week, and I did this inventory of kind of how I got to this place, I realized something really, really important. I realized that the loneliness wasn't a problem that I needed to fix. It was literally my human speaking to me, telling me what it needed, right? Like I have spent the last year really diving into my soul, into, my purpose and my passions and my creativity and what I'm meant to do here, and my connection to the universe and to the divine and my creative power and all of those things that go with soul exploration, and done some amazing things and made some amazing connections because of all of that. But it was like my human was like tapping me on the shoulder and being like, hey, so excited what you've done this last year. So happy for you. But you kind of forgot about me. And that's when I really recognized how a lot of the spiritual frameworks, they tend to orient people to transcend emotion, to bypass their human. Like if you would have told me this whole last year that I was emotional bypassing, or I was bypassing my human, I would have told you that no, I'm just spiritually embodied, right? And all of the things that, I was teaching about nervous system regulation and perspective shifts and higher consciousness and making meaning of the things that we typically have a hard time absolving from a human lens, like taking that higher perspective to be able to reconcile the cognitive dissonance we feel. I've recognized that in a lot of spiritual frameworks, feeling emotion often gets reframed as ego and attachment or insecurity or misalignment. But I've recognized through this experience that not every single emotion is something that you have to rise above. Some emotions are just simply information. You don't have to attach, you don't have to cling. You just have to observe and see what your human is telling you. From my perspective, embodiment is learning how to hold both your human and your soul. And the one thing I keep coming back to is the human informs the soul, and the soul holds the human. And that was exactly what I experienced last week. So if you have a moment and you feel any sort of emotion, it doesn't mean that you're unhealed. It doesn't mean that you're regressing. It doesn't mean that you need to fix yourself. It might simply mean that the current life structure you're in no longer matches your inner truth. It might mean that your human needs play and contact and resonance. It might mean that something in your life is ready to reorganize. I know that this isn't going to be the full conversation. This is just the beginning. But this last week has really opened my eyes to the way in which we are fragmented. You know, people are operating simply from their human, or people are operating simply from the soul. And what I have realized, having stood on both sides of those equations, is that the peace exists when they're working together. Healing isn't just about awakening your soul. It is also about learning how to stay in relationship with your human. Sometimes the most embodied thing that you can do is to learn to listen.